Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our regular programs and instituted these online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is about women's cooperatives as a site of empowerment and resistance, with Margaret McLaren as our speaker. She has published a book, Women's Activism, Feminism, and Social Justice. It looks at the way two grassroots women's organizations, the Self-Employed Women's Association and Marketplace India, how they empower women through access to livelihoods, as well as fostering leadership capacities that allow them to challenge structural injustice through political and social activism. Well, we'll hear all about that from Margaret in a moment. She's in a few days off to India again, where she'll visit perhaps other cooperatives as well. Margaret is a philosophy professor at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. In addition to her current book, she's also published Feminism, Foucault, and Embodied Subjectivity. So let me hand the floor over to Margaret now. And after her presentation, then we will open the floor for your questions and comments. Okay, take it away.
You're muted, Margaret.
What does Margaret do to unmute herself?
She's unmuted.
I did it. The host was keeping me muted, so I didn't have, I had no power. It happened once before already. But yeah, so now I'm not muted. I'm not going to put it on mute again till later. First of all, thank those of you who are here in person. It's so nice to see so many friends and people who have been influential to me in my career and my work. And I'm going to, so just so you know, I'm going to talk about half an hour, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I'm mostly going to talk informally from a set of notes and outline, but I am sometimes going to read passages from my book where I think I need a definition. And I'm going to start with a couple questions and definitions for background, because I know this is recorded. So even though the people that I'm looking at know a lot about cooperatives and workplace democracy and economic democracy, I'm not going to assume that everyone who looks at the talk later knows that. So I've been working, I think Cliff mentioned this, but I've been working on cooperatives, researching them, going and learning from them since 2004 in India. I visited cooperatives in other places, including in Mexico and San Miguel, but India is where my research is and has been. And I focused mainly on two cooperatives, which I'm going to talk about more in depth. One is called the Self-Employed Women's Association, and one is called Marketplace India, as Cliff said. So first, before I start, as introductory, as part of my introductory remarks, I want to say, I want to answer two questions. Why cooperatives and why women? So sometimes in the past, well, in the past 18 years since I've been working on cooperatives, people have often conflated cooperatives with microcredit, microfinance, or other kinds of projects for women, particularly in the global South. But I'm not, there's problems with those. And if you were here for Sylvia Frederici's talk, she talked a little bit about the problems actually with microcredit and the debt-basedness of loans for women. But cooperatives for me are very significant because they are an alternative economic structure that empowers workers. It's a workplace and economic democracy on a small scale that can be thought of and I don't want to say, what is that phrase? There's a phrase now we're using in academia all the time, scaled up. I actually hate that phrase, but it can be scaled up to being a collection of cooperatives or to thinking about economic globalization or economic democracy in a larger sense. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to read a short part from my book about cooperatives where I quote our friends, Bob and Betsy, Bob Stone and Betsy Bowman. So cooperatives have a much longer history than microfinance institutions. Unlike microfinance institutions, they did not emerge out of international development projects. They emerged in the mid-1800s as a form of resistance to the emergence of industrialization and global capitalism. Significantly, cooperatives are member-owned and engaged in democratic decision-making. According to the International Cooperative Association website, quote, cooperatives are businesses owned and run by and for their members. Whether the members are customers, employees, or residents, they have an equal say in what the business does and a share in the profits. Betsy Bowman and Bob Stone offer a broader definition. Quote, a cooperative is an autonomous, non-governmental association formed to meet its members' economic, social, and/or cultural needs through a jointly owned, democratically controlled enterprise. The common thread in these definitions is that cooperatives are member-owned and democratically controlled organizations. By definition, cooperatives have a higher goal than simply making profits. That is, to have a collective, sustainable enterprise that provides employment while meeting the needs of the community. Moreover, when a cooperative is for profit, as many are, not the ones I work with, but some are for profit, like Ocean Spray in the US, the profits are shared equally among the members or in a way that all members have agreed to or voted on. Cooperatives are distinguished from other business enterprises by their egalitarian structure, goals, and values. They explicitly hold values of the explicitly held values of cooperatives include self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And that's also from the International Cooperatives Alliance website. Okay, so that's that for cooperatives. That's why I'm interested in them. I think they're a tremendously powerful vehicle for social change, partly because they are an alternative structure for work and labor, but also in the case of the ones that I've looked at and talked about, they actually promote social activism among the members that goes beyond the economic democracy in the workplaces. So the second question, in terms of introductory remarks before I talk about the specific cooperatives, is why women? Why women's cooperatives, right? There's other kinds of cooperatives. There's a lot of co-ed cooperatives. And I'm also specifically interested in production cooperatives, although SEWA has a lot of, they're not all production cooperatives. Why women? Because women have a unique place in the workforce and in labor. There's a traditional gender division of labor that includes women doing a lot of care work. And also for the traditional gender division of labor, care work that women do is invisible. It's often unpaid or underpaid, and often women are not either in the formal workplace because of the burden of care for children, the elderly, ill, but also when women are in the workplace, they are usually, especially again in the global South, but historically it's true, as they are entered into the workplace, they usually are paid lower wages. They're part-time and contingent labor, and they're often seen as more docile and more easily controlled actually than men in the workforce. And this was especially true in when women began to do a lot of factory work, when there became a lot of the export-free zones, right? So the trade zones of other countries like the maquiladoras along the U.S.-Mexican border, and women were even seen. There was a whole kind of like discourse that relies on stereotypes about women, that they have nimble fingers and that they're they're great about detail work, and so that they were well suited for at the time work in the textile factory, but also in light industries like technology. Okay, so there's another, and then the second part of why I'm interested in women, focused on women. So in the light of globalization, especially since the 1980s, so in the light of neoliberal economic globalization, that's had a differential impact on women. So the effect of a neoliberal economic globalization is very gendered. One of the reasons is that with the structural adjustment programs, a lot of things were privatized, and some of the things that were privatized included childcare, healthcare, education, and social services. Those are things that not only when they were privatized, they began to cost money, making them inaccessible to people without resources. And also, when women did have jobs in the formal economy, they often held those jobs. Those are very gendered jobs. When we think about globalization and economic globalization, there's a huge gendered differential impact on women. So women really are more affected by that. Okay, now I'm going to transition into, another little part of the introduction. So another aspect of the issue of the global economy is that I shouldn't say we, but many people, when they think about the economy, they don't think about the informal economy. But actually, the informal economy and informal labor is the largest sector of labor in the world. So more than 50%, more than half of the world's workers work in the informal economy. The latest ILO report said 61% of workers work in the informal sector of the economy. And this means they have no job security, low wages, no benefits. They're not governed by labor laws, and they often work in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. And of course, with no job security, low wages, and no benefits, they also don't have housing security, food security, or any kinds of reliable health care. Again, from the 2018 International Labor Organization report, quote, "While not all workers in the informal economy are poor, poverty is both a cause and a consequence of informality." So that's important, because the first organization that I'm going to tell you about, and the larger of the two organizations that I've been doing my research on, the Self-Employed Women's Association, its primary focus was and is to organize women workers in the informal economy. That is its mission. So the people they work with were already working, but they weren't working within the formal structures. So again, they didn't have steady jobs, they didn't have regulated wages, no benefits, no collective power, as I'll talk about a little bit later. So the Self-Employed Women's Association was founded in 1972. It was founded by a woman named Ela Bott. When Ela Bott founded the organization, she was a lawyer for the Textile Labor Association, which is a labor union. That's actually based on Gandhian principles. It's a labor union in India. It's based in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, where there was a lot of textile work, particularly before the British occupation. And then she founded the organization for two reasons. One is that she had already been working in labor, and she wanted women to have the benefits of unionization, right? She already worked for a labor union, and she wanted women to have the benefits of unionization, which they by and large didn't have. And then she reached out to women through her job at TLA, but soon SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, became a separate organization. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about their first campaign, and then a quote from Ela Bott, and then I have specific examples of their work and how it's empowered women and contributed to resistance. So the first campaign in 1977, some women who were doing home-based work, making quilts from the scraps from the textile mills in the community, they reached out to Elabat. They had seen Sewa already existed because it was founded in 1972. So they had seen some of the improvements in women's lives who were Sewa members and what was going on. And these particular home-based workers were Muslim, and they had, they wanted to stay in the home and work, right? So they weren't going to go to a workplace. They weren't interested in being like mainstreamed into a formalized, setting or situation. But they did want fair wages for their labor. And I will just maybe read a little bit about their story. All right. If I can find it. All right. Yes. Okay. So here's a little background and to their story. So one of the occupations, as I said, was making these quilts called chindi quilts, and they were from the scraps. So the fabric scraps were picked up by a trader, someone who like trades them, and a middleman. Picked up the scraps, sold them to the women, who stitched them into quilts. It took 2 days to make a quilt for the women, so 2 days of labor, because these are little pieces of fabric. They were composed of 60 to 90 individual pieces, and they only received 7.2 rupees, which is about 20 cents per quilt for 2 days of labor. And this wasn't a fair wage, even in the local economy, in terms of what other people were getting or living wage. And it didn't even count for the cost of production. So not only was it not a fair wage for the labor, but here's a quote from Elabat. By using her own workplace and providing her own sewing machine, electricity, vessels for washing, fuel for boiling water, cleaning products, and even the thread for sewing, all of which she paid for with her own money, she was in fact subsidizing the trader. So the trader would give them this, or sell them the scraps, they would do the work, then the trader would pick up the finished product and take it to the market and sell it as a quilt. And basically the women weren't earning anything for their work at all. So they weren't very pleased. I mean, so they came to Elabat and they said, we would like to, we've seen that you've had some success and we would like to make money for what we're doing. So they did organize. They organized and they had a successful strike. They actually stopped dealing with the trader and the middleman. They went to offices, like official offices, to get to complain about the really low wage. So so it was a 3-year period. So here's what they did. For 3 years, they lobbied, they wrote letters, they held demonstrations, they held meetings with the ministers of finance and labor. But then the chindi traders, or the people who were picking up the scraps and buying the quilts, they just stopped buying them, right? So that was okay though, because the women were able to organize into a cooperative where they could actually market their own products. And in the end, they that raised the price of the quilts, and they still then would buy some materials from the traders, but they were able to leverage the power of them working together. And also Sewa, which I can talk about, but it's not part of my talk. Sewa has a cooperative bank as well, which is a member-owned bank where people contribute just a very small amount, but then anyone can borrow. And so they also had, because of the structure of Sewa, they had a buffer, right? They knew that if they failed to sell a quilt, they would not be starving, right? They could still access resources and money because they were now part of a collective group working for higher wages, but also with a basically a social net, right? A safety structure, a social net that's provided by the fact that this is a organization that's cooperatives and unions. So that's part of the background. Then just a quick quote from Elabat. So cooperatives really are at the core of the self-employed women's associations, but not just economic cooperatives. And this is something that, again, I'm not going to talk too much about in the talk, but maybe people will have questions or we could have a discussion about it. Cooperatives are related to just a whole different set of values in life, right? They're not, they're people-oriented, not profit-oriented. They're life-giving and life-sustaining. There are people now who talk about social reproduction theory, right, as a recognizing of the life-sustaining power of care work and social reproduction theory. So this is what Ela Bott says about cooperatives. Cooperation is a way of life, a philosophy, an approach to human problems based on the principle of equity and justice. All human beings are equal in their right to live and to develop, and can be free only if they are not exploited by others, but are independently productive and creative members of society. So that's her vision, right? I mean, it's not just about organizing workers. I mean, it is about organizing workers, of course. That is the core of the mission of this organization. But the bigger vision is about creative, sustainable lives. Okay, so now so I want to tell you just a little bit background about, I'll have to go quicker. So the Self-Employed Women's Association is an amazingly diverse organization. If you ever find yourself in India, especially over in Gujarat, visit. So I visited a few times, and it's amazingly diverse. It's got vegetable vendors, so it's all unions and cooperatives. That is the structure, right? That's all they do. But it's vegetable vendors cooperatives. It's a midwives cooperative. They have a dairy cooperative. They have a union for their recyclers, and they have a union for people who clean buildings. The cigarette rollers, right, also have a cooperative. There's a construction workers cooperative. There's textile cooperatives. So anything that women were engaged in informal labor in the area, but actually it's no longer just in the area. It's the biggest women's union in India, with over 1.5 million members. So anything that women were engaged in informal labor, the SEWA works to provide a structure and some information and guidance on how to help them form a union or a cooperative. So, and I think that's pretty terrific. So 3 specific examples of the ways that SEWA has, and these are gonna, I'll be reading short passages because they're quotes from the women who are SEWA members, ways that SEWA has changed women's lives and what they think about it. So self-reporting of the women who are members of various cooperatives or unions for SEWA. So the first quote is from Leela, who is a vegetable vendor. And one important thing that SEWA does too, so SEWA, unlike Marketplace India, which is a lot smaller, SEWA actually has a whole research arm to it, and it's got, people who do theory, and Ela Bott was a representative in the Indian government, so it's well networked, and it has representatives. They send representatives to the International Labor Organization worldwide to the meetings. They've started coalitions for home-based workers and street vendors. So it's a really, it started a while ago, 50 years ago, but it's a really comprehensive organization. So in addition to all of that, one of the things that came out of their research is they have, and it was a collaboration between SEWA and actually a university in the US. They started a video production aspect, so that the women, many of whom, actually the majority of whom are illiterate, so that the women could tell their own stories through making film because they taught them to make film. So this is from Leela Datiane, and she's a vegetable vendor, but she also was involved in the filmmaking project. And here's what she says. More training should be given to uneducated women to make videos. When we make videos and women like us watch them, we get confidence and try to make changes. When we see women like us who have done something brave and new, then we get the confidence that we can learn something new too. When poor women see other poor women as health workers on the video, they say, I can also learn about health and help solve these problems in my neighborhood. When other self-employed women see me, a vegetable vendor, making these films, they also have the confidence that they can do things which at first seem impossible. So to me, that's an example of this kind of empowerment that reaches beyond the workplace and the, getting a fair wage and better working conditions, which are, of course, fundamentally important. But the cooperatives and these organizations are doing much more in addition to that. Then the second example is from a woman who was part of a community group in a village where they didn't have their own water tank. So the women had to walk. So if you have done any research or lived in the global south, you know that it is primarily women's job to collect the water, to collect the firewood, and that takes a tremendous amount of time, and both are necessary to sustain daily life. So they didn't have a water tank or any access to water in their village. So this so Guraben is the woman's name, and she's describing for herself what it meant for them to make change. And she says it brought on a tremendous amount of self-confidence. So here's what was going on. Women in Guraben's community had to walk several kilometers every day to another village to fetch water because their village had no water tank. She and the other women fought to get the village to build one. This involved meeting with village and government officials. Guraben notes, quote, "We are not afraid to talk to men or with government officials. Very often we have to pull and push them to work with us. If a government official ignores me, I just go to his boss. If his boss does not listen, I turn to someone else until someone hears me out." So again, there's certain kinds, well, I shouldn't say certain kinds, there's leadership training going on in the workplace, and that leadership training and the ability to do things and the ability to actually, make better wages through collective power translates to the women feeling like they can actually make a change in other areas of their life. And they're making structural changes, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. That's my real interest, is how these kind of changes within the cooperatives and unions lead to them advocating and being agents for social and political change. Okay, then the last thing, I won't read this one, but I'll just give this one as an example. So the self-employed women's organization, there was a very famous, so sometimes when people talk about the global south and particularly Asia, India, Africa, different places, they focus on gender inequality in terms of cultural traditions that are harmful to women or somehow undermine gender equality. So in 1987, there was in Rajasthan, in the state of Rajasthan in India, a woman named Rup Kanwar, and this has been written about for those of you that are academics or do this kind of work. This has been written about by many people. So in 1987, a woman named Rup Kanwar was forced to go on the funeral pyre of her dead husband. She was very young. Her husband died, and then she was there's some debate about whether she was forced to do it or whether it was voluntary, and that's actually part of that's the thing that's been written about. But anyway, this is called sati, and some people think it's an Indian tradition. It's been widely written about and contested, and it was made illegal in the 1800s, and it rarely happens, but sometimes it's the thing that makes the news. Anyway, so the women in Sewa were sitting around talking about it. So one of the things that Sewa does, they have an office, a big office actually in Ahmedabad, where people come in from all the different cooperatives, and they, can get money, information, advice. I mean, it's, and they have meetings too. So at one of the meetings, they were talking about this because it was a sort of a contest between some people thinking, well, it's a cultural tradition, we shouldn't really, but the women said, this is not cultural tradition. This is not something. And the organizations are also very invested in cultural sovereignty, but not in this way. So what happened was the women from Sewa, they sent a delegation to Jaipur, which is the city that it happened in. It was near Jaipur. And they demonstrated in the streets, and they also sent a memorandum to the ministry, to the minister, like the governor, basically, of Rajasthan. So they also protest and do demonstrations for things that really have nothing to do with labor, but have to do with the kind of pressing social issues of the time that are not local, right? So it's a different state. They all had to travel. It's quite a long way, and I'm sure they traveled by land, and what would it be? It would be, I think it was about 2 days of travel to get there and demonstrate. Okay, so those are 3 examples of the ways that women have become empowered and acted partly through the leadership development of these cooperatives, but they're acting again as agents of social and political change. So now Marketplace India, I'll give a little background and 3 examples about that, and then I have closing remarks. So Marketplace India is a much smaller operation than Sewa. It was founded in 1980. It was founded by two sisters. One's Pushpika Fritas and the other one is Lalita Monteiro. Pushpika actually has her master's in social work from the University of Mumbai. They first started to work with socially and economically marginalized members of society, and it wasn't just based on women. In fact, they were specifically focusing on the disabled and on lepers. But very quickly, Pushpika, a woman came to Pushpika and said, "Hey, can you take my stove for a few days? My husband's drunk again and he's going to sell it. And then, we're not going to have a stove." And Pushpika said, "Sure, I'll take your stove and hang on to it." And so that's something that, she recounted in a book. And so she did. And with that, the focus of the organization shifted to women. So it's actually, again, all women's cooperatives, partly so that, they have some control, not just over their finances, but over their destinies and their ability to, put food on the table and cook it. Marketplace is composed of 13 cooperatives. 5 of those produce fabric. They either do batik on it or block printing. So fiber fabric production, those are farther out because they require more land and more space to do the fabric production. I've been to only one of those. And then there's 8 cooperatives that are in urban Mumbai. All of them are in what are called, all of them are in slum areas. And those are there's 8 cooperatives that do the sewing and the embroidering of clothing. And so they're all, unlike Sewa, which, as I said, is wildly diverse and has all sorts of different occupations, Marketplace India does mainly clothing, and they sell it. They export it. It's clothing for export, which again is an important thing. Just quickly, the very first thing that they did is they made a quilt. Quilts are big. People have time, and there's a lot of fabric. But when they went to display the quilts at a fair in Mumbai, there wasn't a huge market because in order to get a price to really compensate the women for their work, they had to charge more than people in the local economy could pay. So then Pushpika came to the US and she brought some clothes that the women had made, and they sold well, and they can price them high because they're marketing to the US. So yeah, and they market to Europe too, but it's all marketed. So all the stuff they do is for export. So that's what they do. They're all clothes, mostly women's clothes. There's a few men's clothing, and then there's some household goods, like pillowcases and, stuff like that. Okay, so Marketplace's mission, here's their mission, and I quote, "It's a pioneering nonprofit that empowers women in India to break the cycle of poverty as they become leaders in their work, their home, and their neighborhoods, and affect lasting change in their communities." And I have been, again, to Marketplace several times over the last 18 years. And there's 3 examples that I want to just talk about now of ways that the women have engaged in social and political action. So, and those I have written down, but I'm not going to read them. So first, all the cooperatives have different names. So Pushpanjali, Ugar, they all have different names. So the Pushpanjali cooperative, and this is an example that I use in my book too. The Pushpanjali cooperative was concerned about the raw sewage in their neighborhood. So they had raw sewage, and again, this is not unusual in India in the urban slums. So they had raw sewage in the neighborhood with no covers on it. Now, this is not only unpleasant, right, because of the smell, but it's also really dangerous. One is you can step in it and twist your ankle, hurt yourself, and step in raw sewage. But 2 is that there's always fluid in it. And so it becomes a breeding ground for malarial mosquitoes, right? And it actually increased the level of infant mortality in the community, in the neighborhood, right? So it's not just, this is a huge public health issue. So they'd been, trying to get something done about it for a while, but they weren't getting traction. But when they took it on as a cooperative, so then the cooperatives are not that big. There's about 500 members altogether spread over 13 cooperatives. And the cooperatives are about 20, they can range from like 10 to 25 people per cooperative. So in this neighborhood, and usually people walk to work, right? So, the cooperatives are like neighborhood based, but I'll talk a little bit more about the diversity within the cooperatives if you want to. Anyway, so they took this on explicitly as their project. So they went to city officials, they educated them, they went door to door in their neighborhood, they had a door to door campaign, they wrote letters, and they demonstrated. I love this. There's always a demonstration in all of these, right? They demonstrated, and within a year, they got covers over their sewage ditches, right? So they had a concerted campaign, multi-level, grassroots, but also working through government officials, right? Because they have to, it's an infrastructural issue, right? It's not an individual issue. So then I'll just say, so this change in infrastructure has positive ramifications for everyone, including, as I said, a lower infant mortality rate, fewer breeding grounds for malarial mosquitoes, and a generally cleaner and safer environment. And a lot of the women who were involved in this campaign before they joined the cooperative, they rarely left the house. They hadn't done public speaking, and they weren't political or social activists. So this is, again, a tremendous, change through the working in a democratic workplace that is looking not just at individual improvement, but social change, structural social change. The second example is in India. They have a rationing program for some of the poorest sectors of society where they provide rice and oil. So a lot of the women, well, most of the women in the cooperatives come from, are impoverished. They're very poor, and they are, they qualify for rations. So the problem was, though, that the people who were distributing the rations, so this like comes from the federal government, goes to the states, the communities. So then there's a distribution process. So the people who were distributing the rations were shorting women. So they were like, putting an extra, like hiding an extra weight in the rice so that the rice would seem to weigh more. So they'd be getting less rice to take home, or they would short them on the oil. And these are sort of, this is the daily bread and butter, right? You've got to have rice and oil to make any meal in India. So they decided to take action because, again, this affected them every day, and it affected everyone who got the rations. So this is what they did. They got together, and in this time, several cooperatives worked together, right? So it was a lot of women. So I don't know, I have several. This is a story they told me when I was there. So I forgot to ask, was it 5? Was it 7? But it was several. So what they did is they got together, and they also went to the police, and they said, so what they, some of the women went in, for their rations, right? Because they had to catch them in the act of doing it. Some observed what was going on, right? So they weren't claiming rations, they were there as observers. And some were outside with the police, who they also contacted to help, to help stop this corruption. But even when they did this, people were still getting shortchanged on their rations. So then they demonstrated, actually, in Mumbai. And after the demonstrations, the government intervened and they improved the supervisory process. So they had supervisors in the distribution centers so that they would not be shorting people on the rations. And then the third example from Marketplace India is health education. So in one cooperative, the women were interested in having more control over their own health and being educated about it. So they got an outside organization to do a workshop on, on a preventative health, mostly preventative health. So they got an outside organization to do a workshop for them, focusing on inexpensive home remedies, right? So things like plants or things that they could easily access. So not things that you would have to go to the doctor for. So then after they got the workshop information, they then created a workshop that they could do for all the other cooperatives in the organization. And again, because the majority of the women are illiterate, and the educational status or level varies, but a lot of the women dropped out of school before what we call the 7th grade, so before they were 14. But some of the women have less education than that, and many of them are illiterate. And also, many of them come from rural areas and small villages, and so they may not actually have a shared language, or Marathi, which because this is in Maharashtra, may not be their first language, and they may not speak Hindi at all, and often not English at all. Anyway, so what they did is they did peer health workshops. Then the one group got trained and they did peer workshops, and they did plays and flip charts, and it was interactive and creative, and they were able to, again, share this information in ways that were culturally and contextually appropriate. Now, I'm gonna draw out some takeaways from these examples, And that's going to be my concluding remarks. So focusing on particular, and I'm going to read this part, focusing on particular local issues helps each group to successfully set and reach their collective goals and also fosters a sense of solidarity and collective empowerment. In the first example, the right to a healthy environment or clean water may be a background condition for not having open sewage in your neighborhood, but that abstract right alone does not secure the changes to make it happen at the local level. The women did not appeal to an abstract concept of rights, but to the very concrete dangers to their own health and that of their families and community. Moreover, changes in infrastructure are a public good best advocated for through a collective effort. In the second example, the idea of basic rights may have been behind the ration distribution program, but without addressing the implementation of the process, these basic rights remained unfulfilled. Fulfilling them required collective effort and social and political engagement. Finally, peer health workshops that focus on inexpensive home remedies and transmit information in culturally and contextually appropriate ways addresses information and economic inequality while respecting cultural sovereignty and creating community. Several things can be learned from these examples, and these are my concluding remarks. Collective action is more important than individual rights when addressing and challenging structural injustice because issues that violate the rights of individuals may be infrastructural and require a community effort. Global or universal frameworks are not well equipped to provide solutions because they often ignore cultural and historical context, and in doing so, they may impose frameworks and values that perpetuate colonialism. Attention and sensitivity to cultural context while simultaneously engaging in projects of social change, such as covering sewers, gaining access to food rations, and creating health education programs, implicitly rejects the idea that culture is at odds with gender equality. Collective action replaces autonomy as the key element in achieving one's goals, and community is more foundational than a notion of individual freedom, which in typical philosophical discourse is portrayed as freedom from attachment and community. Beginning from local concrete situations does not mean that analysis stays at the descriptive level. On the contrary, members of oppressed groups are well situated to understand and challenge unjust situations and structures. When outsiders recognize that authority and wisdom arise from local knowledge and experience, we see that the theory-practice relationship is bivalent. Practices have norms and ideals that are implicit in them and are often explicitly stated by activists and practitioners. The norms of collective action, community, and anti-exploitation undergird the practices engaged in by the grassroots women's organizations I learned from in India. These normative ideals can be fruitful not only for challenging structural oppression in specific situations, but also for addressing transnational structures of injustice, such as global capitalism, the neoliberal economy, gendered labor, etc. I suggest, and this is just about transnational feminism, which my research is a part of, or is considered a part of, I suggest we reframe transnational feminism as a project of learning from feminist activists and practitioners how they pursue struggles for justice in their local and national context, and learn what values, norms, and ideals guide their work. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Margaret. Now we want to open the floor for your questions and comments. Those of you who are with us on YouTube will have to send your questions by email to me at global.justice.cliff@gmail.com, and I will pass them on to Margaret here in the Zoom room. And those of you who are with us in the Zoom room, of course, can raise your questions much more directly. Simply wave at me so I can see you, and I'll ask you to unmute. So who would like to start the discussion? Okay, I see Betsy Bowman waving.
Hi, Margaret. I really appreciated your description of all these different cooperatives. And I noted that they've been around for a long time. And that is a clue to their success. Obviously, you were not talking about cooperatives that were started 40 years ago and ended 35 years ago. We've had a lot of trouble here in Mexico starting cooperatives, but we work with cooperatives that have been around for a long time. I wanted to ask you specifically about the bank that what was it? The first group that you talked about that they had formed, because the huge success of the Mondragon cooperatives is really due to the Caja Laboral that they started, the bank that they started, which then eventually, of course, that's in Spain, that's in a first world country. Ultimately, it ends up serving as a pension for the workers and so forth, or for the members of the co-op. But how does this bank work that you were referring to?
Thanks. So the bank was started by the members, and each member contributed a very small amount. I think it was the equivalent of 10 cents, but there were a lot of members, and I can look up the exact amount if you want. And then each person, so you have to contribute, right? You have to contribute to be a member of the bank. So each person who contributes to the bank, and it's a small amount, then can borrow, not based on their contribution, but that can borrow money, they can get like underwriting for insurance. They can, one of the innovative things, the cooperatives, the workers' cooperatives, one of the things that is emphasized is saving money in a savings program. And then the bank also has a mobile, they have a mobile, they go around with a van. They have identity cards that are pictures and thumbprints, right? So you don't have to even be able to sign your name to be a member of the bank. For a lot of the women, they didn't have, first of all, a lot of their families didn't have bank accounts, right? Because, they're impoverished and they're living in slums. And so they might be the only member to have a bank account, but also it's not as common for women as to have bank accounts than men. So the bank now, they weren't grant funded, and it's very different than the Grameen Bank. Like some people, again, there's a lot of comparisons. Well, first of all, it was founded before the Grameen Bank. And then first of all, prior to the Grameen Bank. And second of all, it's based on a savings model, and you have to be able to contribute to draw money from it. And it's not, there's not rotating loans. It's not a kind of, you get a loan to start a business. People sometimes get loans because they've had a death in their family and they need to, throw a funeral, or, they have a health crisis, or, so it operates like a regular bank, except it is member owned. And, you have to contribute to the bank in order to be able to, get loans and have it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So it's not designed as leading to an eventual pension or specifically as microloans. That's what I was wondering about. And it's interesting, you mentioned that people might borrow for a funeral. In South Africa, I learned about a co-op bank that gave everybody the right to, or they would give anyone who had a death in the family, the co-op bank would give them the money that they needed for a burial. And that's how they got so many people to join, because people don't have enough money to pay for a burial, and they would have to sell their home or whatever. Right. So it was a great idea.
Yeah, they do work. So not through the bank, they have pensions, but they do have, so there's a lot of different kinds of structural pieces to SEWA, to the Self-Employed Women's Association. And part of it does work on pensions and insurance, but that's actually separate from the bank.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see Ann Ferguson has a question. And after that, Norma Harrison.
Okay, thank you. I just a comment on Betsy's question and then a question. So we have here locally Wellspring Cooperative Corporation. It's actually not a co-op itself. It's a nonprofit that raises funds for startups for co-ops and also trains people who are starting co-ops. And it does seem, I'm just wondering if, and this just connects to Betsy's question, whether in the India case there are any the co-op banks that support these associations of co-ops also have donors that are that are just doing that because they believe in solidarity and so forth, that are more middle class. So I wanted to raise that question, and then I have another question, but I'll wait till you say something about that.
Okay. They don't have individual donors, but I think after the bank, so I know that at its inception, the Sewa Bank was only member
Gotcha.
contributions. But then after it got established, I think that they did have a grant donation to the bank, but it's not consistently funded by grant donations. So it is really just with 1.5 million members in India. If people just put a little bit in, it's a tremendous resource, right? If each person puts $1 in, that's $1.5 million to borrow. So and that was actually how the bank got started. One of the women at one of these big meetings with it was an outside meeting with hundreds of women, and they were talking about the fact that they didn't have capital to do certain things. And one of the women said, "We are poor, but we're so many," which is the title of Ella Bott's book. "We are poor, but so many. Why don't we start our own bank?" And they did. So,
And so, thank you, Margaret, and thank you so much for your presentation. I have another question about the empowerment of women in these co-ops. Maxine Molyneux created this concept and studying women's movements in Latin America of the distinction between practical gender interests and strategic gender interests. And practical gender interests were ones that women felt they had as wives and mothers in the division of caring work going to them to be caring for their families. So almost all the ones that you mentioned in the examples seem to be practical gender interests. And I'm wondering about the strategic gender interests, according to Molyneux, sometimes it's called emancipatory gender interests, were more ones which actually put women on a parity with men. So reproductive rights, rights against domestic violence and sexual violence, of men, perhaps also rights to equal political participation with men. I'm wondering if you have any examples of how your co-ops might have helped with that kind of more emancipatory gender or strategic gender interests.
I do. I have two quick examples about that. So in the one case, so with domestic gender violence, I didn't talk about this, but with Marketplace India, one of the women, well, I mean, there's more than one, but this is one of the stories I know about. So one of the women, her husband was beating her. He was abusive, and the women went to the house en masse and confronted him and said, it's unacceptable and you can't do this. They also provided a safe, they let her stay with them, right? So they provided a safe haven for her. Now so I just want to say, so I recognize that that's not, the same kind of at the structural level of creating a domestic violence shelter or changing policies and laws, although actually, domestic violence is already illegal in India as it is in the US, right? So laws and policies, that's part of why I'm interested in grassroots work is that laws and policies, even when they exist, they're not always effective in stopping things like gender violence. So I think that the collective power that the women have to change the individual situations can also affect the gender strategic interests, because then the men in that community recognize that they cannot continue to abuse their wives, or the women have the power to move out of the situation. And not just because they as an individual have a job, it's because they have a community that's going to go to the house and say, yeah, you can't do this. Then the second example is, I didn't read it, but it's another example of a woman in a village, and she was in a village, and in that particular village, the men didn't want the women to leave to go to Sewa meetings. So this is a Sewa example. And the women said, but we want to leave the village, but it was a very traditional village. And then the women reminded the men that going to the Sewa meetings and engaging in other kinds of academic activity got the village through the agricultural dry times, because it's the rural villages. Like, when there's a drought, they don't eat. So they're like, but wait, what we're doing can, give us a consistent, like, not income, but yeah, consistent resources, subsistence resources throughout the year, instead of being, kind of captive to agricultural luck and drought. And then the result was that the woman was very pleased, because before she walked through the village and they would say, oh, she's the wife of so and so. But now when she walks through the village, they call her by her name. Right. So she saw it. So again, it's, you might think, oh, well, this is just like a little story that the village is better, the women can go out. But I see it as I see actually a kind of overlap, not a necessary connection, but a contingent maybe connection between achieving practical gender interest and the strategic gender interest. Because as the women were able to do something in their own local villages or in their own lives, it would cause a ripple of structural change where in that village, women's gender equality improved, right? Because they were then seen as equals. And why were they seen as equals? Because they were able to make change. They were able to do things, right? They were agents. So I don't know if that answers your question,
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Thank you.
okay.
Okay, next, Norma Harrison has a question. And after that, Sally Latch.
Hi, and that was very good, as usual things are on this kind of program. It's nice to see you. So it's already much been addressed by the previous questions. I've been thinking about the effect on men that this has to have. And I'm sure you're aware of that. And I'm sure the women get to be very aware of it. The liberatory effect of self-activation, so forth. I lived with an alcoholic for a very long time. He was not abusive and a problem, but he was upset and angry and disoriented for lack of access to the system. There was only so much he could do to be able to be effective in the world we lived in, strong, so forth. And he resorted to drink. Well, he was Irish, no. And his father did it too. So he and we got along very well. He died much before his time, and I'm very sad about that. But those elements of behavior, I'm sure you're aware, affect what's going on. It sounds like a brilliant path that you've created, that you and they have created. They talked about Hugo Chavez at one time, saying that Hugo followed the people's lead, which we all appreciate that we do. Black people liberated themselves in the sense of the standing up for the struggle. So what do we do about the men? Oh, you mentioned somebody having to protect her stove, and in the face of the husband getting drunk and selling it. And I'm thinking, what else is it? You can't answer this. I think maybe we can just acknowledge that things will change. And that it's going to be a battle, and that everybody has to know that it is. Hey, man, we're taking your woman away from subservience to you, and it's going to be different when she comes back, etc. So, any comment, I think, maybe is all.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. So there is actually quite a bit written in the development literature. So one of the areas, of course, that I've been reading in to do this work is development literature. And there's actually quite a bit written in development literature about men's resistance to women being prioritized in various, and this, goes for the co-ops too, even though they're not actually part of development scheme, but a lot of the microfinance organizations and things like that are part of international development projects. And so there's been a lot written about the resistance of men, and some people have argued, Nelia Kabir and other people have argued that empowering women in this way and giving them economic independence actually makes things worse for them, right? Because if the men are abusive, they're going to be. But no, wait, I have a.
I'm just reacting.
Right. So, so I do have a quote, but I don't think I can find it on the fly. But I remember it. So in one of the cooperatives, and this one was actually a cleaning cooperative. It's called Surya Cooperative. The men were. And then I have another comment about it too, about alcoholism actually. But the men were very resistant to the women. And this one actually I think is a union, not a cooperative. So the men were initially really resistant to the women, being unionized and sort of standing up, and because it does require more than just going to work, right? It requires meetings and organization, and but then, I mean, the women were working anyway, right? I mean, they were already doing the cleaning work, right? So it's not as though they weren't working before. They're just now getting paid for it. They're able to negotiate their own contracts now. They got raises. So in this particular example, the men, and it's a woman talking about her situation, her husband, as he realized the benefits for them as a family, right, and they now had a more livable income, he was less resistant to it. And back to the alcoholism. So one of the things that I didn't mention is a lot of, especially with Marketplace India, more than Sewa, so everyone's impoverished, right? And most of the people are in families, right? They're living in families. Most are not single, but for especially Marketplace India, a lot of people. So it's mostly in Mumbai, which is a huge city. A lot of people have migrated from the rural areas to the urban areas, but then nobody can find work, right? The men can't find work. The women probably weren't working in the village, but they can't find work. But the men then take up seasonal jobs, and then often because of this situation of not being able to find work, right, and being in an urban environment where things are expensive and you can't provide for your family, a lot of the men are alcoholics, right, or some of them have various health issues or disabilities. Some have jobs like taxi drivers, but the motorcycle taxis, so it's not steady work, or some of them are day laborers on construction. There's a lot of women construction workers actually that also work day labor. So anyway, the kinds of things that you're talking about, where this is something that development, when for a long time, since at least the 70s, right, women have been in development and their role has changed. And one of the critiques is that centering women in these kinds of projects or enterprises can alienate men, or undermine their own self-confidence and ability, confidence and ability to earn. But I think that is true. I think that's
Right.
true, right? But not in every case. And a lot of times, at least in the situations and the stories I've heard, the men sort of again, it's like they recognize they also have, I'll use Anne's phrase from Molyneux, men also have practical interests and strategic interests, and their practical interests that now they can eat and now they have a steady income. Sometimes those might actually influence their strategic gender interest to give up, the power of patriarchy. So
it'd be neat, I think, and this is kind of an additional comment to what I was saying, your involvement, to say to here now relative to what you've been saying, the introduction or the encouragement of the fury and rage at the system that does this to people, and it's incorporated into how we live today, and we live today in the profit system. And so the idea of going beyond, okay, you have these things achieved, now what's the direction following this? Well, socialism is the following direction. And so just the encouragement of people to rage on and say it should never have come to this, and what we're looking for is an arrangement where we are all allowed to take care of each other in functional ways that feel good, and that the outcome every day is something we've done that we enjoy, etc. So, however you talk about socialism, and I do that a lot, as being an objective to salve your sorrow, to salve your discomfort. Well, this is on the road to be, etc.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, some people think, oh, cooperatives, that's just like a liberal reformist thing. And yeah, it's not a liberal reformist thing. You have to have intermediate institutions and structures, right? In addition
Absolutely.
to global structures that are, ways of socialists, right? More democratic, radically participatorily democratic and economically democratic. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
Sally Latch is next, and after that, then Bob Stone. Sally, turn on your camera so we can see you.
Can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Sally. Maybe she's muted by the host, as I was.
No, I unmuted her.
Unmute yourself, Sally. I'm with you, Sally.
Should we go to Bob's question and then come back to Sally once she figures out how to unmute herself?
It seems like she's in a quandary. So, yes, okay. Let's go to Bob, and we'll come back to you, Sally.
She is unmuted.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to say how happy we are to have here in San Miguel Allende, Mexico, our comrade from New York, Carol Lapidus, who many of you will recognize from RPA and Sophia and other plotting organizations. I'm blown away by this presentation, which shows that co-ops are not just leading to social change, but are themselves the instruments of it. And that when you need, there's the phrase social capital, which I hate. They are social capital in as much as, for example, as Anne and Betsy pointed out, you form a bank. It's a natural way of doing your internal accounting in any co-op. You need a bank to put your money in, which is the money profit part of it. But you're talking about all sorts of social gains, like getting sewers, like getting the fucking violent men off your backs, like all these other instrumentalities that are there already in the form of the co-op. It's just extremely fruitful. It's an arrow in the air of telos, a direction. And I want to ask you to please tell us your vision of where it's headed and how this can go, where it can go. And we all have dreams of for a liberated humanity. How do we? Where are you seeing this going yourself?
So let me just see if I'm clear on the question, and then I'll try to answer it. Are you asking where I see specifically the cooperatives going, or the project of economic democracy, or a combination of both?
It seems to me that cooperatives in the capitalist system, the dominant system, have a money function expressed in the banking expression of that power. But they also have a transformative visionary function of social change. They are themselves instruments for social change toward, well, one way of putting it, abandoning productive labor as the basis for making our world in favor of reproductive labor. That's to say, the labor that women have been doing, which is to say, making human beings. Suppose we all were aimed at making human beings. Do you see this as an instrumentality for doing that?
Yes, but I think more is needed. I think cooperatives are only part of what we need to kind of reproduce human life in a way that's humane, equitable, creative, and sustainable. One of the things that I didn't talk about that I actually do talk about in my book. So first I'll talk about the ways that cooperatives can contribute to that and the ways that they can network to have more of a more wide-reaching global economic impact. And actually several of you work on this too, so you can just jump on in. But I do think so. I think that a lot of times, again, fair trade is maligned as some kind of, liberal, reformist and half-baked idea. But fair trade has the bottom line also of people before profit, environmental responsibility, sustainability, and equitability. And almost all the cooperatives that I know about, including agricultural cooperatives like with coffee and chocolate, in addition to the ones that I work on, they all they're all fair trade, right? So there's a huge connection between cooperatives and fair trade. So fair trade is the labeling that as a consumer makes you know that people were not exploited, right? Because there is actually a certain kind of process organizations have to go through to get the label. And there's actually different kinds of fair trade labels, but I won't go into that. So that's one thing, is that if we think about just on the producer consumer end of transforming social and economic relationships. But that's only one small part of it, because obviously we have to have large structural changes, right? I mean, you have to have changes in the IMF and the World Bank. You have to have changes in corporate structure. You have to have changes in people's commitment. People have a commitment to capitalism. I mean, most people have a commitment to capitalism, except people who aren't benefiting. I do actually think that actually with the COVID, some of this has shifted, right? I mean, I think people who were marginalized before COVID for all sorts of reasons are even more marginalized now. Certain populations that are, like Native Americans, African Americans, they had more health, more health preconditions and comorbidities based on things like poverty and social conditions and access to healthcare and all sorts of biases within healthcare. And then people who in the care industry, primarily women, but not only women, also people of color. And in the US, there's the largest population of nurses and care workers are actually Filipino, and it's mainly Filipino men as well as women. So anyway, back to your question. I think we need all sorts of change. I mean, I think cooperatives are one way where change can be transformative, and it's a way to think about workplace change and how practices within the workplace of democracy and empowerment through the feeling that you are an agent and an equal member of a workplace, especially for people in situations where that hasn't been the case in one's life or in the larger society. Those can be transformative, and that's what I see in my work and research. But that's certainly not the only thing. I mean, my vision, if you want to know my vision, Bob, well, my vision is an anti-militarist, anti-capitalist, creative, sustainable society that is, going to take seriously the issue of climate change, as well as other things, and make radical changes in every area. And of course, one of those changes would be to focus on care and care labor and, its devaluation in every sphere, and women taking on the majority of that labor. And obviously, the world is going to, as Betsy and I were talking before the talk, obviously things are not going to go well for us unless we start to put reproduction of living beings in the center of our future plans. and not kind of like instrumentalizing things or, means end or, corporate greed. I mean, but so much needs to be fixed. So, but Anne, I know Anne's done a lot of work on global economy, and so might have something to weigh in here too.
I think you might have fixed Sally Latch's connection.
I will defer to Sally because she's been waiting, but I thought you did a very full answer, Margaret. Much to add.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Sally.
Hi. I don't know what my picture is, but anyway, I'm here. And I'm so glad you're there, Margaret. It's wonderful to hear your presentation. I learned a lot. Of course, I have wonderful memories of my stay with you a few years ago. That was a great time for me. I have a question for you. A few years ago, I was in Goa, and I stayed on the beach a month at least. And during that time, I got to know some of the women who worked on the beach. They would, excuse me, they would sell little trinkets and saris and, whatever they could. And they were from Karnataka, which I understand is the, lowest of the low. They were very, very poor. You can imagine that they were, really exploited. I saw with my own eyes, the so-called police would come up, different groups would come up, groups of men claiming to be the police, asking for a tax from them. They do it like 2 or 3 times a day and take money from these women. I heard stories of them, some of them being raped. And so have you got any information by any chance if those women have joined together in some kind of a cooperative to protect themselves?
I don't know about the specific group of women that in Goa and from Karnataka, but there are vendors cooperatives. So I mean, if they're vendors, so if they're selling things, they're vendors. So Sewa does have vendors cooperatives, and they have. So even though they started in the state of Gujarat in India, there's actually Sewa organizations in almost every state. I think 15 out of 19 states. So there's organizations, Sewa organizations in those. But I do want to say that so in Sewa, I also have examples and stories. That's not uncommon for the police to ask for money from vendors. That's actually part of the problem of the informal economy. And part of what Sewa did when they organized was they were able to stop that. And again, power in numbers. They went to the headquarters, they went to the chief. They refused to give basically it's bribes, right? They're called taxes, but it's a bribe. And yes, sometimes they were, prior to that, they were sometimes beaten by the police. One of the issues was that before the women were unionized or formed cooperatives, they're vending on the street, right? So the street is public property. So then the police would say, well, you've got to move from here, or, pay me whatever, pay me $5, or you have to move. But the vendors though, so in Gujarat and Ahmedabad, so I do know that they have strong unions, and they were able to stop both the police brutality and the police corruption through joining together. So if the women from Karnataka have access to Sewa, or they could find out the model, because it's not just Sewa, it's nationwide, and so it would be open to them. And I'm not sure if they have the information about it, or how, if you're still in touch with them, perhaps you could get it to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not in touch with them anymore, but I appreciate your information. I do hope that they find some way to join together. They sure need help. So thank you, Margaret. I hope you have a great trip to India. Safe journey.
Thanks.
Do I see Peggy Rivage Soul raising her hand? So
Thanks, Cliff. And Margaret, thank you so much. And it's so nice to see so many of you on the screen today. And hi, Anne, after a really long time. When Anne was speaking, another question came to my mind. I was really fascinated, Margaret, by everything you had to say, and especially what's going on in Gujarat. I mean, it's so big, it's so massive, it's so much a part of the culture. And I wondered, when you were doing your work there, did you run into the panchayats in these rural areas? I mean, did that, and is there a relationship between the development of those cooperatives and women's leadership in these small groups of the small governmental groups within the rural areas? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's great to see you, Peggy, too. It's great to see so many familiar faces here on, today, and it's great to see you. I did sometimes run into the panchayats. I did a lot of the work with Marketplace was in Mumbai, and as I said, in urban slums. But the work with Sewa, some of it is urban and much of it is rural. And then I did some work which I didn't talk about and actually haven't really written about yet, but I did some work around Kolkata, and some of that was in the rural areas. And where I'm going in India now, and next week, in a few days actually, it's a rural area. So I expect to, even though my primary project is not the co-ops, I expect to have a lot more contact with the villages. But to talk about your question, so actually the panchayats are very interesting, and a lot of times you will read about them in national news when something's gone wildly wrong, like when someone didn't agree to an arranged marriage, and the tribal leader protested, and bad things happened. So again, though that's not good, and a lot of times the panchayats in the villages are very traditional and very patriarchal, but there actually is a gender quota. So India, this is a really interesting, and I don't know, I wish I had the statistics, but I think I remember them. But India is pretty low, like on the gender equality scale. So it's like the gender gap, gender equality scale. So India is like really low in education and healthcare and women in the workforce. They're really high on political participation. And the reason is there's actually quotas at not only the state level and the national level, but even at the level of the panchayat, there has to be a set number of women per tribal council. I personally haven't really seen a shift, and I haven't had, so granted, my contact, since my interest is in the cooperatives, when I've gone, I've mostly gone like the midwives cooperative I talked to just the women. I didn't talk to the tribal leader. So usually when I go to a place, or the dairy cooperative, right? I went to the dairy and I met everyone coming to and from the dairy, and now they had refrigeration and it was great. But anyway, so I don't usually talk to the tribal leaders or to the panchayat, but I know there is representation of women because there has to be, because there's a quota, but I actually don't think, from my just like observation, but without studying it or doing research, and also from my reading, because I always, of course, read the news when I'm in India, and obviously you get much more news about India in India. I read the news here too, but it doesn't really talk about India that much. Anyway, so from what I can tell, the inclusion of women in the panchayats is, first of all, it's not a 50% quota. I know that. I think it's like 2 per council, but the councils are pretty small, like 10 people. I haven't seen a really big shift. It doesn't seem to me like it's moving towards, like, the ruling of villages is moving towards a kind of like a more matrifocal ruling. Wouldn't it be nice if it were? So that's a long answer to your question, but I'm not as, I'm sure there are other people that know a lot more about that particular issue than I do, but I do know that India is not, it was surprising the countries it was ahead of in terms of political participation. I can look up those numbers and send them if anyone's interested in, but it was, like sort of like, and it's better with political participation than many developed countries, so-called developed countries. But whether that makes at the village level with the day-to-day life a difference in terms of gender equality or equity, I have not seen that to be the case.
I wanted to put a question in here. I'm curious, to what extent does India have a cooperative tradition? Um, and to what extent was British colonialism a powerful force that undermined that and, to create the capitalist social relations?
That's a good question, and I have two separate parallel answers to it. Um, India had a cooperative tradition, partly because, well, for many reasons, but both the person I'm going now to study, Rabindranath Tagore, he was very interested in rural development. So a lot of the cooperatives are, again, agricultural, village, and even under Gandhi. So Gandhi was a contemporary of Tagore. They both were late 1800s, early 1900s. So even Gandhi talked about cooperatives and talked about the villages, right? So his whole idea of self-sufficiency, and of villages working together. He thought the kind of solution to India's poverty was in, kind of this labor in the villages, particularly the cooperative structure. So that's one answer, is that it has a long tradition, but I don't know if it precedes the British colonialism, the British colonization of India. So I don't, since, it was already colonized, right, when Rabindranath and Gandhi were talking about cooperatives. But then the other thing is right now, and this is something, again, so I'm interested in grassroots organizations, and they are cooperatives, but they're also NGOs and they're nonprofit cooperatives. But there's a huge tradition and structure of cooperatives in India. And, like I said, just generally, and in India too, not all cooperatives are nonprofit. So there's a lot of cooperatives. Like if you go to India and you'll see signs on the street, like such and such a cooperative, and, so it's a little bit deceiving because you can say you're a cooperative without having the kind of one member, one vote, completely egalitarian structure, profit sharing. If it is a profit-based cooperative, the structure of cooperatives in India is a little bit different. And actually, I have to, one of my friends who teaches management in India, actually, she's a professor of management. We've talked about that there's various kinds of cooperatives in India, but not all of them meet the what I would call the criteria of cooperatives that I've set out in my talk, in this talk, and the criteria of cooperatives that I think is important. So yeah, they have there's kind of a wide net of things that can call themselves cooperatives in India, but mine are in the narrower purview of the wide net.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Well, if not, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank Margaret McLaren for her presentation, and all of you who contributed to the discussion. Thank you very much. Give you a hand, a virtual hand.
Thanks.
Today's program, as well as previous webinars, are accessible on our website, globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you will join us again next week, when we will have with us Ann Ferguson,
Yay!
who's been here in this Zoom session. But she will be talking on neoliberalism, patriarchy, and women's rights in U.S. and Argentinian abortion politics. So we will move to another part of the global South. So please join us next Monday at 1 p.m. Mexico time. But let me remind you that Mexico is still on Standard Time. So those of you who are in the U.S. and on daylight time now will find a different time differential than you are used to. So let me end by giving thanks to our webinar team, Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestres, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Betsy Bowman, and Bob Stone, and myself. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off.